Thanks very much for your patience during the break. I really do appreciate it. We're now at the last panel of the day. Yay! It's a Friday afternoon, and at this point you might be tempted to intellectually think, well, I'm in neutral. Let's just coast and bring this thing home. But let me encourage you not to think of being in neutral. Let me encourage you to try to be engaged. And the reason I say that is that in a city full of panels, this is one that I think has the promise to be very, very special. And I have to say that I was not the person that dreamed up the idea of the panel, but I am a fervent convert of the panel at this point. The intellectual father, or mother, I should say, of this panel was one of our senior industry and innovation fellows, Carolyn Brandon, who observed that first, that the term efficiency, as we use it in the spectrum space, is used by people from different backgrounds, from technology, from economics, from the consumer behavior perspective, from the financial community. And we all may mean different things by that term. And so part of the goal of moving forward with intelligent policy design might just turn on our ability to understand what we mean by that term efficiency and what efficiency we really do intend to promote. So everyone would agree generally that efficiency is a good thing relative to inefficiency, but we'd like to understand what do we mean by the term efficiency. So I'll let Carolyn describe the details of what she has in mind for the panel and to introduce the panelists, but let me just say that I'm, for one, very much looking forward to this presentation. I hope you are as well.
Thank you very much, Professor. And I just want to remind everybody in the audience we are in the home stretch. We are almost done with our day. So thank you all very much for staying around. I think actually, as John said, this is going to be a really interesting conversation because we have at the table folks from backgrounds in the consumer advocacy space, economics, business and investment, and engineering. And I think as we all heard today, in terms of the technical conversations, there are evolutions going on within network infrastructure equipment and technologies, in the handset and chipset technologies, and certainly we heard from our last speaker about the evolution of the business model. And what we wanted to do here with this panel is dive a little bit deeper into that term John referenced, which is efficiency. What does efficiency mean when you are talking about the distribution and use of spectrum? And so, without further ado, Peter Rasavi is going to kick off and provide us with a sense from an engineering perspective, what does efficient spectrum deployment and use mean when you are an engineer? And then he will be followed by Scott Walston, who is a senior fellow here at the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, who will share with us what the economic literature says. Then we will hear from Anna Maria Kovacs, who is an analyst with her own firm, Strategic Choices. And then last but certainly not least, and as she said, saving the best for last, we are joined by Dilara Darakshani from Consumers Union, who is going to share her thoughts on ways in which these various different perspectives on efficiency may either impact or be valued or not valued by consumers. We're going to go ahead and let each person share their thoughts, and then we will go ahead and open it up to Q&A. So with that, Peter?
Thanks, Carolyn. So I actually think I have the easy task talking about engineering concepts related to efficient use of spectrum because it's fairly numerical and the concepts are relatively easy, but as you'll see, as easy as they are, they become quite complex when you consider complete network deployments. So I think the first thing we need to do is define what is spectral efficiency. Well, spectral efficiency is not the same as efficient use of spectrum. It's a component, and engineers have this measure called bits per second per hertz. And what it means is if you have a certain amount of spectrum, how many bits per hertz can you extract from that radio channel? And with today's 4G cellular technologies, LTE, we obtain about 1.4 bits per second per hertz. And then with massive amounts of additional engineering, we reach 2.2 bits per second per hertz. That means if you had a 10 megahertz radio channel, as you do on LTE, as deployed today in commercial networks, you have aggregate capacity in that coverage area of 14 megabits per second. So we heard discussions earlier today about gigabit speeds. Well, that's not what we're getting out of wireless today. We're talking about a fairly finite amount of throughput. And then to match that up with what users can actually consume, it's pretty easy for a YouTube user to consume a megabit per second. On a Skype session, 500 kilobits per second. Netflix in high definition mode runs up to 5 megabits per second. Right? So it doesn't take very many users in that LTE coverage area to consume capacity. And that is one reason that we have a spectrum crunch. But going back to the fundamental concept, bits per second per hertz. So what one area of efficiency and engineering is to try and increase that. And this is a very complicated looking chart, but the point is that that second curve is LTE and it's contrasted with other technologies. LTE is the most efficient technology ever developed. And where we are on that curve is that first line at 1.4 bits per second per hertz, 2x2 MIMO. MIMO refers to antenna configuration, multiple input, multiple output. And MIMO actually represents the best way of increasing spectral efficiency. So the next step in network deployments will be 4x2 MIMO, meaning 4 antennas, transmit antennas at the base station, 2 in the handset or other device. And then through progressively more complex MIMO configurations and other technologies such as interference cancellation, we can eventually get to about 2.2, but we're reaching the limits of what can be done with just pure spectral efficiency. And don't forget, this is just the amount of capacity we get relative to radio bandwidth. So what we really have to look at next is cell size and how many cells we have deployed in the network. With a bigger cell, the nice thing about a bigger cell is that we don't need as many cells in the network. So this is actually economically efficient. We don't have to spend as much money on the network. But we end up with lower gigabits per second per square kilometer or bits per second per square meter, bits per second per square meter, however you want to measure it, than you would with a denser network. And that's why the industry is moving towards smaller cells. Yes, you need more cells, you have to invest more, but this is the current trend because you end up with much higher aggregate capacity. So in these two networks, you might be using the same amount of spectrum, but you're getting much more bandwidth in the denser network. So from a pure technical point of view, you're using the spectrum more efficiently. But the problem with small cells is that they are technically more difficult than one might think. And this picture shows different ways of doing small cells. In both cases, there's a macro cell providing coverage over a wide area, and then you might have unplanned deployments. You don't know where devices are going to be, so you just put in some pico cells, cells with smaller coverage. In other situations, you might know where people are going to be. They're going to be congregating here and there, so then you have a planned deployment, you can be more selective. So small cells definitely increase capacity for the same amount of spectrum. But they are challenging, and they have inherent limits, meaning there's just a limit to how many you can economically deploy. And that's where you have to consider economic efficiency. So from a pure technical point of view, you might say, well, if we just put up pico cells everywhere, but you end up with a network that costs $1 trillion, so that's not necessarily a good solution. And some of the challenges for small cells are backhaul. We don't necessarily know how to interconnect all these cells. There's interference coordination. A lot of the work in 3GPP, the third generation partnership project that does the LTE specification, is on how do you manage interference between picos and macros, especially if they're using the same radio channels. How do you manage them, provision them? How do you protect them? How do you power them? So this is really an ongoing work. I would say over the rest of the decade, we'll become progressively better at deploying small cells. And we have a good start. It's occurring. Most of the operators have announced various small cell initiatives. But if you look at it from a multi-decade approach, we're in early days of small cell technology. So using these measures of cell size and spectral efficiency, then we have to ask, well, Wi-Fi, LTE, white space networks, are they efficient users of spectrum? And I would say Wi-Fi, yes, it is spectrally efficient. The technology is 802.11ac, the state-of-the-art, use very advanced modulation, MIMO, etc. They do get a lot of bits per second out bandwidth, and Wi-Fi inherently has extremely high frequency reuse, meaning you use the radio channel here and use it next door and so forth. Though it was interesting this morning when someone pointed out in the study in Korea that when you totally load up these networks and they start stomping on top of each other, they actually start becoming fairly inefficient. And sometimes when I try and use Wi-Fi in my hotel room at an airport, that seems to be what's going on. LTE, yes, spectrally very efficient, everything being done, and the move towards small cells. TV white spaces, well, I question that because even though it is promising and that's unlicensed, encourages innovation, one of the things that is attractive is that you can do really large cells. Well, if you go back to really large cells and consider a certain amount of bandwidth in that large cell, your bits per second per square meter ends up being low. So it's not necessarily a good solution for metro deployment in the US, but it could be the absolute best solution for developing countries such as Africa and India that don't have a good wireline infrastructure. And at that point, it's not so much engineering efficiency, it's more economic efficiency. So I am pro the technology in the right context. What about sharing, spectrum sharing? It seems efficient, right? You have two different users. Two users using spectrum versus one user somehow seems better on the surface. But that's just not necessarily the case. I truly think sharing is one of those things that depends on the actual context. So the notion is that a government system may not need spectrum all the time or at all locations, but whether that's useful to another entity like a commercial operator is if it can obtain that capacity predictably and if the sharing solutions are practical to implement. So my view on this is yes, in select cases where it's well understood who is going to get what when, then it makes all the sense in the world. And I think most people would probably agree with that. So as we move forward, I just want to make another point about spectrum efficiency, which is that we have reached the limits of what we can do with modulation and error coding. There's something called the Shannon bound, the maximum number of bits per second per hertz that you can obtain relative to noise. And the way to get around that is to transmit that signal to multiple paths in the environment, which is done through these MIMO antenna technologies. And as I mentioned, we're at 2x2 and 4x2. But really, the next phase is going to be something called massive MIMO, where you have literally dozens and eventually hundreds of antennas. But guess what? That can only be done if the wavelengths are fairly small, because the antenna separation is based on wavelength, and that translates to higher frequency. So in fact, massive MIMO can only be done at very high frequencies. So some of our notions today about the value or desirability of low band versus high band is going to change in the future as these technologies evolve. So here we are at the dawn of the mobile broadband era. There are multiple technical aspects, as I mentioned, regarding efficiency. There are also economic considerations. How much does it cost to deploy the network? And in an area I'm absolutely not going to get into at all, but maybe leave for the other panelists, societal good. At this point, I am done. Thank you.
All right, Peter, thank you very much. So bits per second and densification, which was a term I didn't realize was truly a word from today. So seem to be two characteristics that from an engineering perspective would characterize efficient deployment of spectrum. Scott, what can you share in terms of the economics of what does the literature say about how to think about these things?
Right, thanks, John. So actually, I thought Peter did a good job on that side too. So maybe I should just move. But so John asked me to talk a little bit about how economists think about efficiency, and that sounded like a sort of a simple, straightforward task until I realized that was actually the same thing as saying, Scott, tell us what economists do, because we're supposed to mostly think about efficiency. Well, so broadly speaking, when economists talk about efficiency, that means that you're doing something in a way that you can't produce more without also increasing the inputs that you're using. But really what that means is that it's sort of the lowest per unit cost of production, which means it's about the value of those inputs, not the actual amounts of them per se. And then we have this concept of Pareto efficiency, which means that no one can be made better off without making someone else worse off. And then there are other things such as allocative efficiency, which I think we'll also hear about, but possibly not in those terms. But then, especially in industries like wireless and any sort of new technology, then you think about dynamic efficiency, and which is how do these things play out over time? And so there's always a tension between static inefficiency, what is efficient if time were to stop right now, how would you allocate those resources, versus what do you want over time? And that makes it very hard to think about. And so, kind of as a zeroth order point, in any industry that has fast-changing technologies, it's going to be really hard to know whether it's actually operating efficiently, because there will be static inefficiencies, and you don't know how it's going to play out over time. And so also that means looking at it from an economic point of view, any single metric is going to be incomplete. So, people sometimes talk about spectrum use by time or frequency. People who like to criticize the big carriers will say, well, look, we look at their spectrum, we see that not all of it's being used at any given point in time, therefore it's being used inefficiently. But you know that can't be right by itself, right? Because if it were, we would never have stopped analog television, because they're always broadcasting through their 6 megahertz of spectrum. And that's not a very, in most cases, not an especially valuable use of spectrum. It's not an efficient use of society's resources. And by the same token, as you were saying, you could get very, very intense use of every bit of spectrum, or by spectrum that you have, by putting a small cell every 2 feet. But then aside from the fact that we'd be tripping all over them, and it would cost $1 trillion to put them up. That would also be a very inefficient use. So then there are other measures. Some people like to talk about spectrum held per user, and so this is the measure that the big carriers tend to prefer. Right, because by that measure, they have less spectrum than others because they have the most subscribers. But that also can't be right just by itself for dynamic reasons. T-Mobile looks much less efficient, and perhaps it is by other measures too, but they have that spectrum because they want to build out and they want to occupy a particular place in the market. And also, if this were just about efficiency, you wouldn't have carriers saying, please give us more spectrum so that we can be less efficient, because more spectrum gives you more, increases the numerator, right? So that by itself also isn't quite right. But instead, it's a function. Efficiency is going to be a function of the relative costs of all the inputs and the value of the outputs. So, an interesting feature of the spectrum input of inputs to wireless services, which is what we really care about, is that spectrum and technology are both complements and substitutes. The spectrum by itself is worthless without technology to use on that spectrum, and the technology itself is also useless if you don't have spectrum to use it on. But at the same time, as Peter pointed out, you can use technology in different ways to get more intense use out of any given amount of spectrum, right? So to some extent, they're also substitutes, which makes it also even more difficult to think about what is the sort of most economically efficient use of that. And another thing, just as an aside, we've heard a lot about sharing today, and I think the problem with the discussion of sharing is that somehow it's being presented as if sharing is a panacea to any problems that wireless faces, especially with government spectrum. And sharing is just another technology. And it may be a great technology, and it may allow us to make much better use of certain spectrum bands, and it's great to have another arrow in the quiver of how to deal with the agencies and the spectrum. But it doesn't do anything about the underlying incentives, right? And so it's another technology, and it's part of the whole mix of technologies and approaches we can take to government spectrum. It's not going to be an answer in itself. So let's see. So there's one thing we do know about spectrum use, and that's that nobody is using it efficiently. So how can you say that nobody's using it efficiently? Well, you did, I said. But what I mean by that is that we know that at best everyone is using it efficiently, conditional on the incredibly uneconomical way spectrum is allocated. right? If spectrum were actually all flexibly available for any use, we would probably see a much different mix of spectrum and technology. And that's not the fault of any particular user of spectrum. It's sort of, it's the hand you're dealt, and we know that every agency, every part of the government is trying to get more spectrum out there to be in various uses. The FCC is focused on the incentive auctions, and NTIA always has a working group to figure out ways of getting government users to use their spectrum more efficiently to get some of it out there. And of course, these agencies just wait until the next president comes around and they can start the discussions again and have done nothing to actually make that happen. But I think that's an important thing to keep in mind when we think about efficiency, because for an industry or for anybody to actually use resources efficiently, it has to be the case that those resources can flow flexibly to where high-value uses are. And I think it's, overall, it's a big success story for the FCC. They've done a really great job on that since the 90s, starting with the auctions. They really have done a lot more in secondary markets than most people, I think, realize in terms of reducing regulatory barriers. But we need to make sure that spectrum can continue to move flexibly to new uses as they become more valuable. And so that's where we have still huge amounts of spectrum still bottled up, and they can't move. And as long as they can't move, then we know that in some kind of net sense, nobody's using it efficiently simply because it's being artificially constrained. And going forward, I think that's what we should be focusing on.
I could have sworn Scott Walston was on the panel, but for a brief moment, I thought I was hearing Tom Hazlett.
It's hard not to channel him sometimes. It's so entertaining.
So Scott, I think, did a very effective job of confirming that there is no clear single definition in the economics as to how to think about these issues. But I think that is reflective of the complexity, and it's one of the reasons we wanted to pull this conversation together. Is these are not simple topics. They're hard, they're complicated, but they're important. That being said, Anna Maria, could you share some thoughts on, I think originally we were talking about capital efficiency. I think your thinking is a little bit bigger than that, but from a research analyst perspective, what are your thoughts?
Sure, and I should say I spent about 25 years as an analyst. I'm not one currently, but that is still very much the way I structure my thinking. At this point, I mostly devote my time to Georgetown. As an analyst, I tend to look at a company holistically. I look at, generally when people think about efficiency, they think about capital investment, they think about how the network operates, they think about sort of the asset. But in fact, how efficiently a company operates depends very much on balancing the various functions that are performed within a company. To give a very simplistic example out of a different industry, when we think of McDonald's, we think of hamburgers, but how well McDonald's operates depends as much on whether they get their real estate in the right places where people might actually drive by, how well they train their people to smile as pleasantly on the 500th customer of the day as they do on the first, how clean they keep their facilities. All of those issues are part of how efficiently McDonald's operates and how well they do financially, which is obviously ultimately what analysts care about. Same thing is true within the wireless industry. Obviously, getting the spectrum a company needs is a prerequisite to being in the business. Spending the capital to develop that spectrum to the absolute maximum ability that they have to get the most out of it is critical. But that also has to be balanced with the functions of marketing, for example, making sure that you're not selling to a lot more people than you actually have the spectrum to service, making sure that you're optimizing the devices that you are providing along with the network that you're providing, and optimizing the network, obviously, and then comes back to your capital investment and spectrum. So in the context of an actual operating company, all of those piece parts have to work together as well as possible. And I guess one of the differences between an economist and an analyst who's been an analyst for several decades is analysts know that very often companies are not operating optimally, and that an awful lot of, in fact, very rarely do all of them operate perfectly, and some do so to a much greater or lesser extent than others. And that, I think, is a big piece of what is not part of, has not been part of the discussion of the issues in Washington, which is, the discussion around spectrum has evolved very much into a discussion about manipulating market shares, essentially, without a lot of consideration about how actual company performance and efficient management of the companies has played into the evolution of the industry. So I think as we look at all of these things, we need to look not only at who owns how much spectrum and whether they have invested more or less per subscriber, although there are enormous differences in how much the companies have invested per subscriber, with the largest companies, ironically, having invested by far the most, despite what are assumed to be their really good spectrum positions. I think we also need to look more broadly at what else is being done to optimize the picture in terms of operations.
Laura?
Can I just interrupt for a second?
No.
Yes, I'm going to, because just as you accused me of being Tom Hanks, I think
You might be watching. We are on live stream, Scott. You can wave at him. Delora, quick, I guess maybe a kickoff question for you, and then I really do want some conversation amongst us as well as from the audience. From a consumer perspective, do any of these points around efficiencies, does it really matter? And if yes or no, how so?
So I have prepared remarks, so I'm going to go quick. And hopefully I will answer some of your questions. So I would say from the consumer perspective, spectrum efficiency is about three things. It's about driving competition. It's about making more spectrum available to satisfy consumer demand for wireless broadband. And it's about ensuring that there's a mix of licensed and unlicensed spectrum in the market. One of the questions asked today is what makes for an efficient distribution of spectrum. And I think that one of the answers to this question is that is a spectrum auction that actually promotes competition in this market. Consumers will not be able to reap the benefits of any additional spectrum that is brought to market unless the market is sufficiently competitive. The two largest providers of wireless service today are in a position to dominate the auctions, and we believe that the government should put in place appropriate rules to give small carriers the opportunity to bid on this important resource as well. We do welcome today's announcement by the administration to further explore federal spectrum use in the efforts to better satisfy consumer demand for wireless service. And we agree with President Obama that it's important to make additional spectrum available as promptly as possible for the benefit of consumers. We were also very glad to see, though, that the plan directs the NTIA and FCC to carefully consider the implications of future spectrum decisions on the important public policy goals of national security and law enforcement. So efficiency is also about carriers making, as Andrea said, the proper capital investments to make use of their existing spectrum. DOJ did recently recognize this in their much talked about filing, that consumers are harmed when spectrum is not built out upon. And for this reason, I want to make the important point that giving spectrum to the largest carriers should not be the only consideration in determining what makes spectrum use and distribution efficient. Spectrum efficiency is also about ensuring that carriers are not just going to sit on the spectrum that they have, and that they make the appropriate capital investments to put spectrum to use. Thirdly, efficient use of spectrum also means ensuring that there's a mix of licensed and unlicensed spectrum in the market. Consumers will benefit if there's a robust amount of spectrum set aside for unlicensed use. And the example of Wi-Fi, I think, aptly illustrates this, in light of the important role that it plays in alleviating some of the spectrum constraints out there today. As consumer demand for wireless broadband continues to skyrocket, Wi-Fi networks serve as an increasingly important role not only in offloading wireless data onto these networks, but also in expanding service. Finally, we do believe that efficiency should not necessarily be equated with the highest amount of revenue. The optimal distribution of spectrum should not be based solely on who can bid the most money. These models that assert this underplay the importance of competition and diversity in the market. A lot of these models equate consumer welfare with giving spectrum to the largest carriers, but there's a real value to having competitors in the market who innovate and often provide consumers with new choices. And I'd like to point out actually that DOJ and the judge and the AT&T T-Mobile merger also identified this. So the largest carriers aren't necessarily the ones who will provide consumers with the greatest benefit. The fact is that it is still highly unprofitable to build out in certain areas, and there's no business case to do so. So for that reason, I think we also have some concern about making sure that rural areas in particular are not left behind. Furthermore, history has shown that some of the buyers of spectrum may not necessarily put that spectrum into service for long periods of time. So I think that's something that needs to be considered. All that being said, we do think there's a real value in engaging in a discussion with consumers instead of simply relying on theoretical models and numbers and formulas. To that end, our magazine actually did a 2012 survey of subscribers in 23 metro areas and on overall satisfaction with cell phone service. And we found that only half of respondents were highly satisfied with their cell phone service. And my only point in bringing this up is to say simply that a discussion of efficiency should go beyond simply economic and technical perspectives and should consider the impact on consumer welfare as well. So, take care.
So to maybe first question to the last speaker, Delara, when you say that we need to extend the conversation to the consumer perspective, I guess the question then would be, what is your answer there?
The answer is whatever the consumers tell us. The answer is, I think we're happy to play a role in engaging consumers in this discussion, actually. The spectrum discussion is probably pretty removed from most of the consumers out there. There's no direct impact, so to speak, on consumers, or maybe they're not aware of the impact it plays, but it's definitely relevant in the prices that they pay and ensuring that there's competition in the market. So hopefully we'll be able to play a role in bringing that to light.
Anna Maria?
A couple of things. One, in the 700 megahertz auction, the small carriers who chose to participate, who represented probably about 10% of the market share in terms of subscribers, wound up buying 28% of the spectrum. So I think if you look at that history, you do have to recognize that small carriers can in fact do pretty well, regardless of who else is participating in the auctions, I guess is one point. And with regard to the issue of subscribers, of consumers, my feeling is that consumers are pretty smart. They know what they want, and they vote with their feet. So when you look at, when you talk about needing to essentially manipulate the market or the auction in order to determine how much more spectrum the large carriers who have been chosen by subscribers, or large because they have been chosen by subscribers, how much spectrum they should get, I get a little bit concerned about degrading service to subscribers who have intentionally chosen certain carriers simply as a way of degrading service, persuading them to leave those carriers, reallocating market share effectively in the market. So I believe that you need to respect consumers, you need to respect the choices they've made, and essentially to let the market make its own decisions on all fronts. But
Scott?
Yeah.
We're sharing.
Sorry. And it's working so well. We are sharing spectrum and the hardware. A few points. The first one, I really hope that bringing the sort of the rural side of this into the discussion, I think is that's a different issue, because rural areas always get huge subsidies. And it always ends up those end up as basically big subsidies to companies that don't necessarily benefit consumers. And, oh, by the way, we just did a $300 million reverse auction for Mobile Services Mobility Fund Phase 1. We have $500 million coming up for Mobility Fund Phase 2. If you're worried about access, let's focus on poor people who might have trouble affording it, not just rural areas, because we spend so much money on rural areas already. Keep that as a separate issue. Then on the let's say post-auction market competitiveness issue, on whether to put restrictions on AT&T and Verizon, I think in this auction, and Ruth talked about this too earlier, it's important to remember in the incentive auctions coming up that there are two sides to this auction. And the problem with the DOJ's filing was that it looked at this auction as if it were one of the sort of previous 90 auctions that we've had, as if it were only a forward auction, and that you could just be concerned about the forward side and the allocation of spectrum without taking into account anything else. Now, you could set aside for a moment the question of how one would like to see spectrum allocated, and then you still have this problem of how is the auction going to close if you keep the two biggest bidders out. And I realize that there are models that show that prices may not come down much if you exclude the two largest bidders. I'm a little skeptical of that, but even so, you have to take that into account first, because if the auction doesn't close, or if you clear much less spectrum, then you really haven't done consumers any good if you kept that spectrum from getting onto the market in the first place. So the DOJ's, the Department of Justice's analysis has got to take into account the reverse side of the auction as well as the forward side of the auction. And part of that is this discussion of how spectrum should be allocated afterwards, but part of it is how it affects the ability of the auction to close. And there's another thing I forgot.
You can interrupt unless Tom calls you again. Let's pause and include the audience here. Any questions?
I can shout. I'd be fine.
The microphones are all up front.
But we don't want to share.
Good heavens, I'm so sorry for the delay. First of all, Scott, you didn't really defend yourself when your moderator said that there was... that must have been what it was, right? That there was no economic... you didn't talk about efficiency for spectrum, an economic definition, that you didn't really in the end provide one because you have so many different ways of looking at it. But I thought at the end you did provide a definition of spectrum efficiency because you talked about inefficient allocation of spectrum, which is when there are barriers for spectrum to flow to where it's most needed. So that reverse is where there are barriers for an efficient use of spectrum is removing barriers. So I took exception to your summary of his statement. I'm sorry, I'm stuttering, but I'm trying to get to the questions. My questions are, okay, one is has to do with subsidies, which you brought up. Do subsidies help efficiency? And two of the issues have come up here. One is the USF fund, which does help rural and underserved areas, but raises the cost of phone bills for everybody else. And the other one is making spectrum available at rural areas, which is usually done by reducing the cost of the spectrum. You bid so much and then you get a 10 or 20% discount off the bid. That's one question. And the other question is, what is appropriate capital investment? And who makes a decision about what's appropriate? Those are my two questions. Okay? Did I get them out clearly?
Well, I think certainly there is fodder there for any one of the four of you to respond. So, Scott, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I have the mic anyway. The question about the subsidy issue is a big one, especially because it gets directly into also the question of allocative efficiency. So we may have societal goals that are not economic per se, but we believe as a society are important. And so if people can't afford, let's say in general, we want to make sure that some minimum level of service is available to everybody up to some point, right? And so that may not be a technically efficient use of resources, but we decide that it's through our policy processes, so we decide that that's a cost we're willing to do. But then the question becomes, once you decide that you want to do that, what is the most cost-effective way of doing it, right? And then that gets into how are we paying for it, because we know that we pay for these subsidies in hugely inefficient ways by taxing everyone's phone bills, which is a regressive tax because everybody has to pay for it regardless of how wealthy you are. And if you live in a rural area, you're a beneficiary of it, whether or not you're poor or whether you live in Aspen. So that's not a particularly on net good thing for people who probably are on the side of that equation that we want to help. But it's a hard question. You have to decide how, you need to have, I think, a clear idea of what the costs are, and then think about what is the most cost-effective way to do it, and how much do we want to spend.
Absolutely. Would you like me to share my microphone?
So first, I would disagree with the characterization of USF aid as a tax on everyone else, but that's okay.
It's a fact. That's how it's paid for. It's not a matter of opinion.
What is that?
Okay.
It's taking to 3/4 of the time tax.
Well, I'll just finish my sentence. My only point being that there are millions of families who depend on these services for basic access to vital telecommunication service, and that's definitely something that's important to our organization. I feel like the larger carriers, there's a race to 5G right now. There's a race to provide the fastest, most efficient, poor use of words, service to people as possible. Why don't we fix service in the areas that it exists already and extend it to the areas where it's needed before, racing to 5G, and that just made me think of that.
Dora, very quickly before Anna Maria jumps in, can you give us examples of what you mean when you say fix the service where it doesn't exist, or?
Well, I mean, rural areas is an example. I mean, it doesn't exist, and you're shaking your head no. There are a lot of areas in which service does not yet exist, so I just don't think that those areas should be left behind in the efforts to expand broadband to as many Americans as possible.
I think perhaps the only reason why you might be getting quizzical looks is just based on the FCC's own information. It's hard to identify the large percentage of Americans living in rural America. I think Anna Maria's noting it's 1.1%. But I mean, that's a legitimate goal for Consumers Union. That's who you want to solve for. Okay, Anna Maria.
It's kind of hard to know where to start. The number for rural areas that are not served by voice is less than 0.5%, and we're well under 1% for some sort of broadband, although not LTE at this point. But what you want to keep in mind is that fraction of 1% occupies probably a quarter of the country. I mean, so going back to your point about why the subsidies are needed, it's not, even though the spectrum may be sold at lower prices, the cost of the build-out in areas that are so sparsely populated is so high that, whatever discount you get on the spectrum isn't even going to begin to touch what it costs you to put the capital in place. So there are going to be places, some of those, where satellite may very well be the only capital efficient way of providing service. There'll be other places where you can get it some of the people because you're getting it a village, but you're not necessarily getting every ranch that's 100 miles outside the village. I mean, it's going to be, to some extent, a patchwork of solutions for all of these people, which has been the issue for USF forever. To get to your other question on who allocates capital and how it should be decided, it seems to me that the efficient way to do it is, in fact, to let the marketplace figure it out. I mean, you have enormous differences, for example, within the wireless industry itself, in terms of how much capital various companies have put in to develop each megahertz of spectrum that they have. And if I were sitting at the FCC looking at that, my inclination would be to try to give the spectrum to those companies that are willing and able to do the most investment to make the most out of that spectrum, because the spectrum is, for the country, the most scarce resource. That's what we have sort of a limited supply of, and the way we manage to serve more and more subscribers is by providing more capital to go to increasingly efficient technologies and rebuild the network over and over again every couple of years to get more and more out of that spectrum. from the perspective of each company, obviously, the most efficient thing to do is to get as much spectrum as you can so that you can trade that off against capital. But I think from an overall, a national perspective, conservative spectrum makes sense.
Peter, I think you wanted to jump in?
I just wanted to expand on a point that Delara made, which I thought was a very good one, which is you can't just look at providing service, you also have to look at the quality of the service. So if the service doesn't work well, you may have extended coverage to somebody, you may have made spectrum available, but if you have a high drop call rate, then it's not really efficient in kind of the societal benefit it provides. And then related to that is congestion. And that's something we talk about the demand for capacity. But the flip side that doesn't get discussed much is, well, what happens when you cannot address that demand? And that's when you have congestion. And I think actually that cellular operators have done a great job in managing the capacity of their network, especially if you contrast it with what's happening in Wi-Fi today. I think Wi-Fi has provided tremendous benefits and created a huge multi-billion-dollar industry. But in a lot of respects, Wi-Fi now is collapsing through its own success. There are so many instances where I've run into where Wi-Fi just doesn't work. I tried to use it at the Portland airport coming out here. I just got this splash screen where normally I just have to accept the terms and conditions, and it came up with a big message saying, sorry, too many users, try again later. I've never seen that before. Yeah, I thought it was weird too. But I didn't have any problem with my cellular connection. So I'm not trying to come across as biased between cellular and Wi-Fi, because I think they're equally important in the industry. But ultimately, kind of the quality of experience also has to be considered in spectrum efficiency. And then in that regard, that kind of raises a whole other question I don't think the industry has really come to terms with, though it's certainly on the roadmap for this decade, which is quality of service mechanisms in broadband networks such as LTE. LTE actually has a very sophisticated quality of service architecture that's network-based, that is policy-driven. You can set up rules where automatically certain classes of applications get different treatment than others. And people who are strong advocates of network neutrality might say, well, that's terrible. We want every bit to be treated equally. But the fact is, certain applications can tolerate delay and lower throughputs, and certain ones cannot. So ultimately, being able to manage quality of service appropriately in a way that's non-competitive, I think will result in higher efficiencies in these networks. And that's just a whole area that we have not even begun to tackle.
Oh my, we have like 6 questions. All right, Professor Mayo, before I get yelled at.
He's asked a bunch already. So Peter, if I could you just then, if I extrapolate just a little bit, define the critical component of efficiency is dependent upon the level of congestion you have at the time. So if you're really going to use efficiency as a parameter or a metric to define what our industry needs to go, it's dependent upon congestion, that level of congestion.
Well, if you're looking at, right, I'm just saying it's simplistic, just as I did up there. I just talk about capacity without considering whether that capacity is actually functioning properly.
You're right, and that was in your introductory remarks, but follow on to that, let's take it to the next step, because if efficiency doesn't have a practical application to industry and to the federal sector for that matter, then what's the point of the discussion, right? So we're looking at how efficiency can help us become more effective, which is critically important. And that said then, how does that impact, or what does that say about our fixed reservation-based process for spectrum, which leads to things like auctions? Isn't that inherently inefficient? Because we generate very, very strict barriers which don't enable us to just operate more freely. Where we could possibly reduce congestion in some areas, but move to areas that aren't as congested. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that.
Fair point. I'm happy to go last. Or if there's time.
It was a question.
Okay. Well, I mean, right. I mean, I think you can envision some completely opportunistic method of using all the spectrum, and I know there are advocates for that. I just don't know if the technology is there yet to support that. But as far as the reservation auction process, that's more a question of economics, so I'll pass on that portion.
The issue of how many people get cellular coverage, the 0.5% population, that's a number which I'm sure is correct. But consultants like Peter and I just made a lot of money in docket 10-4 on the cellular booster issue that was finally resolved after 7 years. On people in rural America who wanted to buy cellular boosters, which cost several $100s, people would not have bought these gadgets for several $100s unless there were real problems in cellular service in rural America. And if you read the report and order in docket 10-4, it on the one hand acknowledges virtually everyone has at least one carrier. One carrier, may not be the carrier they want, but there's one carrier. And also the fact from the beginning of the report in order in docket 10-4 that there are real service problems in rural America. And that's why people buy these things for several $100s, not to be antisocial, not to thumb their nose at the cellular industry. It's people who live in rural America, both in their homes and as they drive to work, and as they drive through rural areas in case they have an accident. And public safety in rural areas had real coverage problems, and that's why they were buying these cellular boosters for several $100s in order to get the service that those of us that live in urbanized areas take for granted. So looking at coverage in rural America is a complex thing. The 99.5% having at least one carrier is a metric. But it's like the issue of how many people. But it doesn't, but read the report in order, docket 10-4, and it talks about other things. It's hard to describe what's going on in rural America. If you have carrier A and you drive through an area where carrier A has no coverage, the fact that carrier B has coverage, if they don't have a roaming agreement or have different technology, doesn't do you a lot of good. So there are real service problems in rural America today, and that number, although factually correct, doesn't reflect the whole picture. Just like my friends in the broadcast industry like to say, the fact that 92% of American homes don't use an antenna is a misleading number. That number is correct, but it doesn't tell the whole picture of people using over-the-air TV, people using cable.
Hey, Peter, quick question. Not being an engineer, so I could be reading this incorrectly, but my understanding of the evolution of LTE is it is going to resolve and potentially, certainly minimize, if not completely resolve, the distinctions between various RF technologies, such that the kinds of situations he's talking about, where there are incompatible networks, becomes less of a factor, whether it's rural or urban.
Well, certainly LTE is becoming the one network that everybody's using. So that does produce economies of scale, harmonization, to be less of a difference.
LTE voice is not widely operational today, right?
LTE voice is right. It's coming online.
Right, but the LTE people use is data LTE. When you're driving in the car, I hope you're not using data LTE.
Right, so that's why we call it an evolution, right? It's being rolled out, it's being developed.
We spent 100 years perfecting our circuit switch infrastructure. Going to packet switch is going to take more than a year.
Right. But all those issues you're talking about, though, are only on one side, and the other side is what is the cost of doing something about it, right? And so the FCC just had this $300 million mobility fund auction, reverse auction. And one thing it did was show how much more they can cover when it's done in a cost-effective way, basically how much incredible waste there is on the rural side. And the rural carriers lobbying, see someone shaking their head, you're already mad, see how mad I can make you. They lobby, the rural carriers lobby really heavily to make sure that these kinds of approaches are not used. They don't want things to be done in a cost-effective way. And when you look at the outcome of the auction, they managed to cover 83,000 road miles for $300 million. Whether road miles was the right metric or not is a different question. It's not obvious that it was. But to cover the next few thousand road miles would have been an extra $140 million based on the bids that they received. So, when you talk about the problems of coverage problems, you also have to think about what are the costs of covering them. And historically, We know all of the research not done by companies that get money for the program show that the high-cost fund has not been effective. But by contrast, money spent on low-income programs has been. Whether it's been cost-effective is a different question, but that has been shown to make a difference. But we have a tendency to move immediately to spend money on rural areas as opposed to on poor people. And I mean, and another example of that, so John and I recently wrote an editorial on the wireless lifeline subsidies, its recent explosion. And then there's this question of whether, actually subsidizing something that people have a high demand for actually makes a difference on the margin, which is an important question that actually a graduate student here is doing a great dissertation on. We'll have the answer to that soon. But I think it's also interesting to look at the reaction to that, what people call Obama phone. And I hope we didn't contribute to this, but as soon as the low-income program started to get big, it was a huge outrage, right? The rural program's been bloated for years. Nobody cares, And then we did these reforms that, in theory, were to cut the universal service program to the high-cost areas. We called the Connect America Fund. The first thing it did was increase spending by $500 million. And people don't realize this, but the high-cost fund now has a $500 million surplus, and it's continuing to accumulate it. And the United States Universal Service Administrative Company is prohibited from ever estimating demand at less than $4.5 billion a year. That's what happens in rural. Nobody can touch rural subsidies. And on top of that, we have a $300 million mobility fund auction. We get another $500 million coming up. But poor people always get screwed. And so I hope that Consumers Union going forward will focus on low-income people, because those are the ones we got.
Laura, do you want to jump in there?
Low-income people, poor people who get screwed are in rural areas also. I think I don't know where we're differing here. I just think that it's important to not leave those people behind in the race to come up with better services.
You need to clip the mic. Clip the mic.
I think we're looking at the rural question the wrong way. The reason why rural areas aren't covered is because it's not economically feasible. Once there is an issue, once there is a solution or something to be deployed there, which will happen, cars are going to be online, people are going to be online, tractors. Once there's more objects out there to start counting, then there's an economic incentive for folks like Verizon or carriers to start delivering things out there. And that will happen over the next 5 or 10 years. As more and more things come online, you're going to see a deployment out in more and more areas.
I should point out that Emil refers to these entities as silicon-based life forms rather than carbon-based life. But they will consume a lot of data.
And there are more points of attachment that are going to come onto the network. And by the way, now all of a sudden the carbon-based life forms will now get coverage because there's going to be this demand from other types of devices.
This conversation is fascinating. It's going in lots of different directions, as we promised it would. Professor Mayo, did you have a question?
I did have one more response, just quickly, about capacity and management of the network. There was this discussion about congestion before. And as we all know, if you can't measure something, you can't manage it. And the one thing that we need to do on all of these devices or on networks that we have is we have to have some sort of governance or policy-based networking that allows you to manage the network in an appropriate way so that you use the resource as efficiently as possible. You just can't continue to allocate spectrum for what has been historically done, at least on the wireless side, was I'll just throw more bandwidth at it or throw more resources or get more fiber. That's not going to happen because it's a finite resource. So we're going to have to subscribe to a situation where we have a managed solution. And that means, yes, some people will be treated as second-class citizens or some applications will be treated as second-class citizens compared to others. It's going to have to be a class-type system.
Professor, I think now's your chance.
No, not yet.
There are some people over here too.
But recall, we're going to try to keep to questions.
Both? Is this on? Yeah, push the button. What? Which one? Both the electric utility industry and the mobile communications industry have finite capacity at a given point in time. It fascinates me that in the communications industry we have flat pricing, and so there's zero marginal cost for using communications, even though you're pressing the capacity, whereas in the electric utility industry and the gas utility industry, there's been pricing that varies with time of day, and particularly sale of interruptible services. And yet no one in the communications industry seems to talk about variable time pricing. As a matter of fact, the express lanes on the Beltway in Virginia have variable pricing where they respond to command. I'm not an economist, I'm just a dumb engineer, but since we have all these distinguished economists here, why is communications pricing, mobile communications pricing, which is pricing against demand, the capacity limit, priced so very differently than electric utility pricing?
I was going to say, I will let you jump in here, but let's not forget, at least I remember when we still had those dial-up phones, that you paid more during certain times of the day, less on weekends. So that pricing certainly used to be the model, and it has evolved over time. And I think Jennifer Fritchie, in her presentation, was indicating that, yet again, the pricing model in the industry is evolving and changing, moving away from the flat rate that you're referencing to something that is not time sensitive necessarily in terms of time of day, but certainly not the bucket pricing that I think most Americans became very comfortable with. But that being said, a more educated answer perhaps from the economists.
One of the reasons is we're not seeing the same sort of peaks and valleys in usage that we used to. Particularly on the broadband side, you're seeing very different usage patterns over the course of the day than we did in the days when it was all focused in rush hour or whatever. So part of it is simply just isn't as relevant anymore.
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think there should be more differential pricing in energy than there is. But I've written before that I think a lot of the pricing mechanisms in broadband seem to be more about covering fixed costs than about congestion per se. I mean, if it's about congestion, having a monthly cap is a pretty crude approach, right? And it does keep people from being huge bandwidth hogs, I guess is the term people like to use. But it's not going to affect, you go to Metro at rush hour, and if you're at Metro Center, it's really hard to use your phone because there's so many people using it, right? And if there were a true, dynamic pricing model, then you could go in there and say, yep, I'm going to pay $10 to use my phone here, and everyone else can clear out. But nobody does anything like that. Maybe people, maybe we can't handle things that are that complicated. But I think at the moment it's just about covering fixed costs, not about congestion per se, except in a very broad sense.
It's truly is your time.
No, I'm still last in the queue. Well, okay. Thank you. First, let me just say that I love the discussion of efficiency here, and I was looking for some sense of commonality in the terms, and I can't say I got it, but let me try a definition that I think will get agreement out of two people, a complete disagreement from one, and a shrug of a shoulder. All right, and who's who? Now let me surprise you farther that I'm going to predict that Scott and Delora are going to agree. Peter's going to shrug his shoulders, and Anna Maria is going to completely disagree. So let me offer, and so now you know what to do. Let me offer that efficiency or the efficient use of resources occurs when the prices that consumers pay, that is how much they have to give up, reflects the cost to society, that is to providers, of supplying the particular resource that they are consuming. And I'm going to guess that that's pretty palatable to Scott, that it might be pretty palatable to Laura, that from a financial analyst perspective, heavens no, you don't want prices that reflect cost, you want prices that are way above cost. And the technologist says, well, I don't know what you do, since you've monetized it, I don't even know what to do with that. So I don't know if any of you agree or all of you disagree with that characterization of what I might imagine you would say to my representation of efficiency being the prices, that it would be efficient if consumers paid prices that reflect the cost to providers of providing the resource to them.
If you're willing to include cost of capital in your cost, I don't have a problem with your definition. So
it should represent, the cost should represent, what consumers say should represent the cost of what is provided to them. I'm not sure if it does, but it should. We say that.
Yeah, that's fine.
Peter, I'm looking for a shrug of your shoulders.
Well, I mean, that sounds like something that would be covered in an economics course, though the only question I have is, where's the motivation there to, for example, deploy more cell sites to address demand?
Fair point, fair point.
And as the lone attorney up here, and just somebody who's been in the industry for a long time, I would agree. I would agree with your characterization. The only hesitation I have is, being in a market-based economy, usually companies will endeavor to spend money if they expect they're going to make some money back in return. So I think a system where the price charged equates to cost would create a market in our space that, I don't know, would devolve into a monopoly because there's no incentive for others to get into it.
Again,
Well,
I think Anne Maria's point reconciles that if you include the cost of capital.
And I don't mean to take Delara's role over or whatever, but the whole debate we had on USF, I think, is relevant. There are situations where the consumer is not going to be able to pay what it would cost to serve them in a very rural area or whatever. And then we're getting into the whole societal issue. So, but on the whole, yeah.
I want it.
All right.
Any other questions? I think we're all getting a little punchy. Yes? Do you want to ask the last question of the day?
Well, this is sort of a big question about efficiency as a concept. And, earlier Jennifer presented on the fact that the top line of the operators is not going up. It's not going up. It's growing up, but it's not really growing. Okay, their margins are good. But at the same time, I've forgotten who gave the presentation that showed that by 2017 there'd be $1 trillion or $3 trillion of value produced in mobile broadband. And so, of course, that's integrating over a number of years. 2025, right?
No, to society.
To society.
Not today, not
to society. Well, yeah. So, of course, it's from a capital allocation point of view and all of this stuff. It seems to me that there's a sort of a disconnect between where the value is being delivered and spectrum allocation. We're making decisions right now based on an uncertain future, based on the promise of all of this, and it seems like that's it's hard to make arguments about efficiency in an arena where the companies that are providing the service that we're arguing about efficient allocation aren't actually retaining very much of the value.
I think that goes to sort of dynamic efficiency and why it's important that spectrum can move to higher value uses. Imagine if 50 years from now, companies that were providing today's wireless services were still providing today's wireless services because if they became today's TV broadcasters. We want to make sure that doesn't happen because we don't know how it will all evolve. And I feel like I have to just say that Robert Fogel, who won a Nobel Prize, he died this week. He made this sort of simple point in his work in the 1960s on railroads and economic growth, where he was saying that people were attributing way too much economic growth to the railroads, but not recognizing that what the railroads provided was, what you should attribute to the railroads was the incremental benefits, that they made something existing better or cheaper, and that's really what to attribute, not all of the economic activity that's related to railroads. And so, we want to be careful when we talk about this $1 trillion. What is the incremental benefit from improving service? And maybe that's sort of a throwaway, but his work was really great, and just since he died this week, I just want to bring that up.
So I think we have certainly not exhausted the topic. I think we could probably talk for hours. However, I just wanted to circle back to something John mentioned at the very beginning of our day, which is one of the roles of the center here at Georgetown is to consider, talk about, analyze, research, document the nexus of policies and business. And in this particular afternoon, we've been focusing on broadband. The objective of this panel was to discuss whether or not and how policy writ large here at the federal level can either encourage or facilitate, enable, improve any one of the kinds of efficiencies that would be discussed. I don't know that we have achieved that objective for the panel, but being at an academic institution, sometimes the conversations that to the business world seem irrelevant are really an exercise of the mind and are really important to have. So while we haven't drawn any conclusions here or answered the question posed with a single sentence, I think or agreed on anything. Well, no, I actually think there was agreement. I do think it's what this conversation confirms is that talking and thinking about this term of efficiency as applied to the issue of spectrum allocation, distribution, and use is important. There are a lot of different ways to think and talk about it. Not a reason not to engage. It is incredibly important, as Ruth Milkman from the FCC pointed out, that spectrum policy that is being shaped right now get it right, as confirmed by some of the numbers in the McKinsey report that she cited. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Mr. Mayo to bring us to a close.
So thank you very much. I opened this morning by saying how delighted we were for you to come. I'm especially delighted for you to have stayed. And I hope the last panel gave you the same level of energy and excitement that it did for me on a Friday afternoon. Please do stay engaged with Georgetown, stay engaged with the center. We will have future events. Please come back and visit and be part of the intellectual discussion. Thanks very much.